Welcome to In the Spotlight, where we take a moment from the fast pace of daily news to dive deeper into the issues and shine light on all that matters. I'm Shahar Azani, and today I would like to touch upon some of the most complex issues pertaining to Israel's geopolitics and regional security: the Palestinian Authority and its future, Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and of course, the Islamic Republic of Iran. What lies ahead for Israel, and what do we all need to know when discussing those issues? I'm absolutely thrilled to have with me in the studio in Times Square today Brigadier General retired Amir Avivi. He is the founder and CEO of Habithonistim, in English, Israel's Defense and Security Forum, the IDSF. A few words of introduction about Amir. Amir Avivi established the IDSF, Israel's Defense and Security Forum, in February of 2020. Only a year and a half ago. That it's comprised of more than 2,000 high-ranking reserve and retired officers, commanders, and operators from all branches of the Israeli security establishment. Together, they came and aimed to promote the national security of the State of Israel, to ensure its existence and prosperity for generations to come. Avivi has retired from the Israeli Defense Forces in 2017. He has more than 30 years of military, counterterrorism, and national defense experience. In his most recent role, he served as the head of auditing and consulting department of the Israeli defense establishment, including the Israel Defense Forces, the Ministry of Defense, and Israel's military industries. In that position, Avivi managed more than 100 auditors and advisors and was responsible for audit and consulting services in various fields of expertise, among them budgeting, procurement, cyber, and logistics. Avivi fulfilled various command positions in the Corps of Engineering, leading thousands of soldiers in a dynamic environment combating terrorism. He served as a brigade commander, deputy division commander, and head of the Military School of Engineers. Previously, serving as a right-hand man for Israeli General Chief of Staff, Avivi was at the heart of the policy-making processes in the Israeli government and defense establishment. Amir, thank you so much and welcome to JBS.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure. Great to be here.
You're here, thankfully in studio, in the United States. Doing what? What's the purpose of your visit here?
Well, I came with some of my colleagues, General Cooper Basser and Lieutenant Colonel Yaron Buskila, to Washington to meet with congressmen and senators, with think tanks, and with the State Department, and discuss some very crucial issues. One of them is the intention to open a consulate, Palestinian consulate in Jerusalem. And we also came to discuss the issue of Iran that seems to be in a very crucial moment, and there needs to be a serious talk about where are we heading with Iran.
So, those issues crucial, but before we touch upon, just because you mentioned the consulate, so the U.S. administration is thinking about reopening a consulate in East Jerusalem, in Jerusalem. First of all, allow me to ask you this. There has been an American consulate in Jerusalem for many years, since 1844. It was closed by the Trump administration, which also moved the embassy to Jerusalem and decided to include the consulate as a section within the embassy. But the current administration decides it does want the consulate. Is that really that big a deal?
Well, I think there is a big misunderstanding about what's happening here. This is not about reopening a consulate, because what they want to open is nothing like the consulate that was before.
Okay.
As you said, Shahar, the consulate was opened in the 19th century during the Ottoman Empire. It was a consulate for everybody. There was no embassy, there was no State of Israel, there was no Palestinian Authority, and the consulate basically served anybody living in the land of Israel, in Palestine at that time. And when they closed the consulate, they basically opened an embassy in Jerusalem, recognizing that Jerusalem is the united, eternally capital of the Jewish people.
Oh, really, I mean, recognizing reality. Jerusalem has been the capital of Israel since its establishment. No matter how much the world tries to look away, that's the fact on the ground.
Exactly, and it has been the capital of the Jewish people for thousands of years, more than 3,000 years.
Right.
Now, there is no such thing opening a consulate in a place where you have an embassy, and especially not opening a consulate for another entity. So basically, when we were in the State Department, we asked, okay, what is your end state? What are you doing this for? Obviously, this is devastating for Israel's sovereignty over Jerusalem. They want to open a consulate, and not only open it on the western side of the city. This is not even talking about dividing Jerusalem, which we completely oppose.
Right.
And we didn't get an answer, and we didn't get an answer for a very simple reason, because what this administration is pushing is basically going back to the idea that Jerusalem is not at all Israel's capital, that this is an international city that belongs to everybody and not a sovereign city under Israel. This is the long-term consequences of opening a foreign consulate in the sovereign capital of the State of Israel.
So it's important, you're stressing that point, and I think it's important for our viewers to understand that we're talking about, exactly as you say, a mission meant to deal with a foreign entity in a capital city of another state,
Exactly.
which is the crux of the issue. But at the end of the day, the Americans require Israeli consent to do so, even in the diplomatic channels. This is customary diplomatic law, that you have to have the agreement of the host country within its territory. You're going to build a mission or open a new mission. Is that the case? Do you sense that the Israeli government will agree to such a move by the administration?
Well, I felt in these meetings that there is a huge pressure on the Prime Minister and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Lapid. It seems to me like the administration feels that there is a new government. They are not very experienced. They are easy to push back. This is not Netanyahu with all his years of experience. And I think this is why they feel they can now push this forward. And I'm hoping that the Israeli government understands how crucial it is not to agree to such a step. Although this government has said that the relations between Israel and the administration are really important, they want to show that they can have better relations with the Democrats, and especially this administration. But doing so, they are exposing themselves to what is perceived by the administration as a weakness of the Israeli government, and a moment they can cease to push forward the policy that favors the Palestinians and actually gives them a stronghold in Jerusalem.
I want to ask you so much about Palestinians and follow up on the issue, but before we dive into the intricacies of the topics, I just want to pause for a minute and ask you about Habithonistim, the Israel Defense and Security Forum, the IDSF, which was just established a year and a half ago. Who are you? What made you establish this organization? Who do you consist of? Who are your members? And you said you were in Washington. What do you hope to achieve within Israel and outside of Israel?
So IDSF is an organization that is composed of high-ranking officers, commanders, and operators from all the Israeli defense establishment. Of course, all of them are retired or in reserve.
Right.
And we push, first of all, the Israeli society to go back to the basic values of Judaism and Zionism. When we talk about national security, we say there is no national security without nationalism, without patriotism, without a deep connection to our roots and why we are here. And today, there is a trend to try to undermine that, to educate the young generation and the society in a way that undermines our most basic values, saying, listen, this is not a Jewish state, we are occupiers here, and this needs to be a democracy as any other democracy, and forget about
the Jewish nation. It's funny, you're talking about education, and that's also the main talk here in the US today,
yes,
about education.
So actually, I'm sure that our listeners and viewers can relate to that, because this fight is also happening in the States. And
but what made you come into being? What made you tell yourself, I need the IDSF?
Yeah, well, actually, I've been thinking about it for decades. And it started when I was aide-de-camp of the chief of staff. At that time, right. There was fierce fighting in Judea and Samaria. We were after Operation Defensive Shield.
What year?
It was in 2004.
Mm-hmm.
I became battalion commander in 2002 in the operation itself. So I found myself in fierce fighting with my battalion
in the West
Judea and Samaria. And At the same time, in Gaza, after the Oslo Accords, we retreated from the major cities, and immediately the Palestinians started building rockets capability. And a few years later, they started shooting thousands of rockets on Israeli towns. So after being battalion commander, I became aide-de-camp, and it was at that time that we were holding major operations in Gaza and still fighting in Judea and Samaria. And then one day, the chief of staff and me hear on TV that the Prime Minister of Israel decided to disengage from Gaza. Think about it. The chief of staff of Israel commands the whole army. He hears on TV that is the Prime Minister wants to withdraw from Gaza. And this is while we are having fierce fighting in Gaza, shooting of rockets, operations, and so on. The situation is completely unstable. So a week later, we had a cabinet meeting. I attended this cabinet meeting. And the Prime Minister asked the Chief of Staff in the meeting. He said, okay, I want to disengage. What's your assessment? And Bogi said to him, Prime Minister...
Bogi Ya'alon, the Chief of Staff at the time.
If you disengage like that from Gaza and connect it to Egypt, in 1 year, Gaza will become Hamastan, Al-Qaedastan, and Hezbollastan. This is what's going to happen. This is going to be the land of Hamas in 1 year. So the Prime Minister asks Dichter, the head of Shin Bet, the Shabak, what do you think? What's your organization assessment? He said exactly what Bogi said. If you connect Gaza to Egypt, endless amount of weapons, know-how, money, terrorists will flow into Gaza, and this is going to be a disaster. And yet, Sharon decided that he's going forward with this plan. And 2 months later, he fired Bogi. He brought a new chief of staff, Dan Chalutz. And then something amazing happened, which I never thought I'll see. The whole Israeli defense establishment, under the command of a new chief of staff, changed their views and said this is not going to be Hamastan, it's going to be Singapore.
Isn't it the decision of the chief, the commander-in-chief, as far as Israel's policy is concerned? Wouldn't you expect the Israeli security establishment to follow the orders of its commander-in-chief elected by the people of Israel?
No, that's not how the defense establishment works. You have professionals, you have intelligence, you have thousands of people researching, and they need to say the professional truth, not what the politicians want to hear. And the professional truth was that the disengagement will create terror state in Gaza.
And you're seeing all of this and feeling what?
So I saw how politicians in 1 minute can be, pursue personal interests or other interests, not necessarily Israel's interest. This we can understand. We know politicians can be, we have different kinds of politicians. I couldn't understand how the Israeli defense establishment can throw their professionality aside and started pushing an agenda that is not professional. And this was very...
So this was brewing in your mind for many years?
And not only that, at the same time you had a whole bunch of retired generals in Israel writing letters and saying to the society, yes, that this engagement will be great, this is going to bring peace, and so on. And anybody who has minimum understanding of reality on the ground knew that this is simply not true. So I said to myself, okay, I have seen the complete collapse of all the Israeli decision-making process in Gaza. And if this happens again, if this happens in Judea and Samaria and the Jordan Valley, that's it. There is no state of Israel.
So fast forward, you see all of these concerns, you feel like you should have a voice within that discussion, and you decided to establish the IDSF.
Yes, I understood that if we don't build a very strong grassroots movement composed of high-ranking officers, commanders, who are solely dedicated to one thing only, ensuring the existence and prosperity of Israel and the Jewish people. That's it, without any other agendas. If we don't do that, we might find ourselves in a reality where we ourselves, as a nation, are undermining our own state.
And how do you get that mission done? What do you do as an organization?
So, it's all about timing, and I started working on that in January 2020, making the first phone calls to some generals to help me build an organization. And maybe a week later, Netanyahu announces a dramatic announcement. He says, we want to apply sovereignty in the Jordan Valley. And I said to myself, wow, this is history. This is something huge. This is extremely important for Israel's national security in the long term. Mm-hmm. So we organized fast a logo, the same one until today. And we sent a letter to Netanyahu that was published in the newspapers saying, we, Israeli Defense and Security Forum, support applying sovereignty in the Jordan Valley. Will secure Israel for generations to come. And once we published this letter, I started getting hundreds of phone calls from officers all over Israel asking what's going on, what is this organization? So, we didn't have a website, we didn't have an organization, not a bank account, anything. I opened a WhatsApp group. It filled in one day.
So Israeli to open a WhatsApp group.
I opened another WhatsApp group and it also filled. Within 2 weeks, I had 300 officers in the organization, what I thought would take me maybe 2 years. And now we are more than 2,500 officers in the organization, and it's growing in the pace of 100 a month.
And how do you achieve this mission to have that voice within Israel? Because your work is in Israel and outside of Israel.
Right. So to achieve this mission, you need to do three main things. One is educate the young generation and explain to them, first of all, who we are. Right. What we're all about. What is the people of Israel? What is the state of Israel? What is our vision? What are our goals? Then we talk about the needs. What are the national security needs for Israel? Not for the next 5 years or 10 years. We say that a 4,000 years nation should be able to look at this 1,000 years ahead. We need to look in the really long term. And we talk about that. What is needed for us to exist? People don't ask these questions. This is why Israel has no red lines. We need to define those lines. So we talk to the young generation about that. We go to the pre-army programs, we go to high schools. We started our first process in working in universities as well. This is one thing. The other thing is reaching to the society. There is a huge, huge gap of knowledge. Even if people's hearts are in the right place, they don't have the tools to explain it.
Right.
So we take, as you said, Shahar, at the beginning, a complex issue, national security, and simplify it for the people to understand what are the basic guidelines they need to follow and understand, and then they need to expect from the politicians to adhere to these guidelines. So you need to educate the general public. How do we do this? Exactly what we do here. We appear on the TV, on radio shows. We write articles in newspapers, both in Israel and abroad. And the third thing we do, talking about what we did now in Washington, we reach the decision makers. We are in very close contact with the Knesset members, with the Prime Minister, with ministers, with Washington, with Europe. We meet with many ambassadors, diplomats. We hold gatherings and talk about these issues. And the voice we bring is an authoritative voice of expert officers who have been for decades on the ground fighting for Israel. We have a lot of experience. And we're the voice of reason.
And that's what you're bringing to the table. You're bringing to the table your experience. Yeah. You say we're not functioning within the political world.
Not at all.
And therefore we can tell you what we think and believe based on the situation on the ground and our experience. Now that's for you to consider and take into account. So you're trying to be a clearer voice on issues that can be very easily quagmired, obscured. It takes time and understanding to really know what people are talking about. For instance, and now I can go back to the issues, when we talk about the consulate in Jerusalem, for a lot of people to hear, hey, on the one hand, we've always had an American consulate in Jerusalem. What's new? And on the other, you sit here and explain that this is a political statement. When you reestablish a consulate at a time when you have an embassy, you're sending a clear message. So in order for people to really have an opinion on the issue, you have to understand what the message is. And I think this is a very crucial. How was your message received meeting with officials and elected officials in Washington?
So the meetings with congressmen and senators, both Democrat and Republican, were very, very good. we saw that everybody is very worried about the Iranian issue.
But on the Palestinian consulate?
On the Palestinian consulate, you know, even Democrats, when you speak with them in a meeting, are willing to admit that that's probably not a good move. They wouldn't say it out loud because they are afraid of the administration and what the voters would say. But most of them understand the issue and they understand how sensitive it is for Israel and for the Israeli-American relationship. They definitely do.
The establishment, you mentioned the Palestinians. Let's talk for a minute about what's happening in Judea and Samaria and with the Palestinian Authority. It's clear, or at least it seems clear, that Israel is propping up the Palestinian Authority and supporting Abu Mazen's rule in that area because it knows what may come in his absence. First of all, is it true? And second of all, what's going to happen in the day after? Isn't it important to open a consulate there to strengthen Abu Mazen against Hamas? Wouldn't that make the moderate Palestinian Authority stronger in the face of an increasingly powerful Hamas?
First of all, I must say that there is nothing moderate about the Palestinian Authority. They fund terror. We just published a research paper, a very elaborate research paper that talks about what's the extent of involvement of the Palestinian Authority in funding terror.
Official PA.
Official PA. They fund terror by their own law. This is institutional, the way they do it. And their goals are no different from Hamas. They have exactly the same goals. They are just differ on the way they want to achieve them. But they are pushing the same goal of destruction of the state of Israel. So I don't see the Palestinian Authority as a partner, and I don't think that they are a solution for anything. And we have seen that for many years. No matter what we suggested to them, they never wanted really a solution. Now things are changing on the ground. Today in the Palestinian Authority you have local leadership, the heads of the clans and tribes of the cities. They are fed up with this corrupt organization, with these terrorists. There are many local leaders who want a relationship with Israel, who are willing to detach themselves from the Palestinian Authority, and they are not taking over only for one reason, because the Israeli government is supporting these terrorists. And we are meeting with these leaders. We're talking to them. They come to us because they feel we have a voice in the defense establishment and in the government. And they are waiting for the moment that Abu Mazen will step down. And it's clear, it's crystal clear, that the day Abu Mazen steps down, whether it's because he dies, because he's old, or he's removed, there is one chance for all the different players to take over. And because that's the situation, there is going to be huge chaos.
Wait, but before the future of the PA, I want to push you a bit on that point that you just mentioned, that the Israeli government is wrong to support the PA. You're talking about localized leaders all over the West Bank, different villages, municipalities, and you'd rather have a situation of dealing with fractured leadership here and there, negotiating with each of them individually, rather than having one concentrated effort with one entity that's supposed to manage the entire area? How is that better?
Well, when you look at the most successful country, Muslim country in the Middle East, it's definitely the United Emirates. And what makes the United Emirates so successful is not the fact that they have more resources. It's not the fact that they have more oil than in Iraq or in other places. It's the fact that this is the only state that is based on the structure of the society, the basic structure of the Muslim society.
It reflects directly the structure.
It reflects the way the society is built, ethnically, and with tribes and clans.
And the PA doesn't?
Not at all. Think about it. What is the PA? The PA is importing a terror organization from Tunis to Judea and Samaria to rule the local society. Now, each place in the Middle East, we did that, whether it's in Syria, whether it's in Lebanon.
But these are Palestinians. You're talking about Tunis, but this is the Palestine Liberation Organization.
Yeah, but
have they no roots on the ground?
The fact that they call themselves that doesn't make them local. It doesn't make them heads of families. And even today, the Palestinian Authority on the ground runs everything through the families in the cities. I can tell
Even
you,
today, after
even
being
today,
on the ground for over 20 years?
Yeah, they cannot do anything without working through the families. This is how the society is built. This is the way the culture is, okay? So what these local leaders are asking themselves, why do we have to accept this corruption, these terrorists, these radical people, when we can be the ones leading? So, you know, Abu Mazen was supposed to hold elections.
Right.
It's the second time that he postpones the elections. They have been, you know, ruling the Palestinians for many, many years without elections, and he knows why. Everybody hates him. Nobody wants him. So if his own society doesn't want him, why are we supporting him?
There is a claim that Palestinians living in those areas of the West Bank are much better off than their brothers and sisters in the Gaza Strip. So the conclusion might be that something is done right in the West Bank when it comes to Palestinian governance and relations with Israel. That's not being done by Hamas, of course, which leads to what we're seeing in Gaza today. And in spite of this, you're saying the Palestinians in those areas do not support Mahmoud Abbas?
Well, they're much better off because many of them work in Israel. Mm-hmm. They are getting paid 3 times more salary than the average salary in the Palestinian Authority.
Right.
Now, what the Palestinian Authority is doing is taking something like half of the budget and directing the budget to incitement and to terror. Think what would have been the situation in Judea and Samaria if half of this budget would have gone for productive things.
Right.
So the potential is much, much, much bigger. It's the Palestinian authorities that make sure that the hate to Jews and to Israel remains through the incitement they do in the schools, through the fact that the best job you can have in this society, more than a Supreme Court judge, is a convicted terrorist. That's the best job you can have in the Palestinian Authority today. So, and the local leaders know that. They know that they're undermining the future of the people. And this is why there needs to be a shift.
Let's talk about distractions for a minute. We started with a possible American consulate in Jerusalem, and it seems like the world or parts of the international community is still focused on the conversation of old. Let's talk about borders, let's talk about settlements, let's talk about Jerusalem. But what you keep on emphasizing is the fact that there is a lot of incitement within the PA. There is a lot of mal-education when it comes to Israel and the Jews in general and anti-Semitism. And as long as that takes place, we will never have any kind of stability, because when you're grooming, the minds of the younger generation to continuously hate, what happens is exactly what we've seen, lost generations. Ever since the Oslo Accords came into our lives 25 years ago, the hope was that we'll see a different situation on the ground. And think about the generations of kids who came into the world within those areas, growing under a Palestinian Authority. And so many of them, if not all of them, have come into the world hating Israel and hating the Jews. People aged 25 today who didn't exist before the PA came into being are exactly where Palestinians or many anti-Israel elements have been. So something has gone wrong. Why isn't the international community paying more attention to incitement and education? Why?
Yeah, this is what we are saying all the time when we meet officials. They don't demand from the Palestinians anything. They are the core problem. There is no peace because the Palestinians don't want peace. And the international community is not dealing seriously with the education, certainly not in Gaza, with the Hamas that is indoctrinizing completely, radicalizing the whole society from the age of 3, and in the Palestinian Authority. You know that in a Palestinian Authority...
That's a very depressing...
No, it's terrible. And I tell you how bad it is. In a Palestinian Authority school or kindergarten, they have the way they sit the pupils in the class. They take the pupils that supposedly come from Haifa and they put them together in one desk. They take the guys that came from Jaffa and they put them in another desk.
That's in the PA?
In the PA. This is not even Hamas.
Not Hamas.
And they all the time tell them, you need to go back to your own towns.
So
there is no single
map. The fight against Israel is imperative to their existence.
Yeah.
So any reality of peace doesn't exist internally.
No, not at all. But still, within this society, what balances a bit the situation is the fact that hundreds of thousands of Palestinians work in Israel. So they see a different reality. They work with Israelis in industrial areas, in Judea and Samaria. They work in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, and so on. They're interacting with the Israeli society, what the Gazans are not doing. So they understand to a certain extent that what they were taught in school is not exactly the real
But when it comes
reality.
from the leadership, when there is no effort made by the leadership to educate for peace, it's a recipe for continuous belligerence between Israelis and Palestinians, and between Israel and any Palestinian entity. You know what was telling to me, Amir? We had the Glasgow Conference of the Parties on issues of climate, the UN Conference on Climate.
Right.
And again, you saw Mohammed Judea, the Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority, comes forth and instead of talking about solutions, talks about how Israel is destroying the environment of the Palestinians and how Israel is taking away olive trees and quarries and with the settlements trying to undermine Palestinian environment. Even in that context of having a joint issue as the one mankind that needs to cope with our planet, they're unable to bring themselves together with the rest of the world and find solutions, but continuously use every possible stage to point the finger at Israel. And nobody sees it aside from us?
Look, we are handling ourselves in two completely different dimensions. They are in a war with us.
Right.
And the war is sophisticated, it's done on the international arena. They are undermining us everywhere. And we think we are in negotiations. Talking, helping, assisting, giving them money, and they are conducting a war against us. And if you don't understand what kind of situation you are living in, that's a big problem. You need to look at reality as it is. Understand what's going on, and understand that there are other solutions and options to solve this issue. We educate, for example, about
that the world insists to ignore.
Yeah.
They're used to one pattern, and this is how they're going to go about this. Before I have to just ask you an important question, because you're talking about alternatives. So let's assume the Palestinian Authority is right now with Mahmoud Abbas, who, as you say, tomorrow can be gone. What's going to happen if Mahmoud Abbas is gone tomorrow, next week, next month, next year? What's going to happen?
Well, there are several scenarios that we need to analyze, and we need to ask ourselves a big question. Do we want, what's good for us, and are we going to get involved, or just let them, solve their own issues? The first scenario, which is a probable one, is anarchy. Anarchy. Why? Because everyone will fight everyone.
On Israel's doorstep.
Yes, on Israel's doorstep, they will fight each other to the death. Why? Because they know that the first leader that manages to gain control, he will kill everybody else.
So we've seen a similar reality in Gaza when Hamas took over from
exactly
from
when
Fatah.
They threw the Fatah from the building,
from the roof.
So everybody understands that this is a one.
They're not into building coalitions.
Yeah. So everybody understands that there's one shot.
Anarchy.
And they will fight each other, and there will be anarchy. This is quite probable.
A probable scenario.
The other scenario.
Do you think the Palestinian Authority as an entity will disintegrate?
It might. In this scenario, it will. Another scenario is a Hamas takeover. Now, I'm less worried about this scenario, because in this scenario, Israel will intervene, for sure, and will take down Hamas. There is no scenario where Hamas, whether locally or all over the Palestinian Authority, gains control in Judea and Samaria, and the IDF doesn't attack them. So this might be a situation where Hamas takes control, and we need to operate and take them down.
We haven't done so in Gaza for years. We allowed Hamas to be there. Generations of Israelis, young Israelis, grow up in the shadow of the missiles coming from Gaza.
You're right.
And we haven't done it. So why would we do it in the West?
But in Judea and Samaria, it's a completely different story. You cannot have Hamas.
Why is that a different story? Are the lives in the south of Israel not important?
Because the mountains of Judea and Samaria completely control all the Israeli cities along the shore.
We can't allow Hamas to come
The distance is meters. It's like, there is no scenario where you can have Hamas controlling. I'll give you an example.
Wait, before. Two scenarios. Anarchy, follow-up, anarchy, and then Hamas taking over. Third
Another scenario is that the Palestinian Authority will remain, and one of the leaders will manage to
take over.
This is a scenario that is possible.
We've heard the old names of Jibril Rajoub, Mohammed Dahlan, others.
Exactly. There are different candidates. I must say that none of them is as strong and well respected as Arafat and Abu Mazen were as founding fathers of
PLO.
Of the PLO. So it will be interesting to see
if they survive
whether this happens. Another scenario I started talking before is the break of the Palestinian Authority into a kind of local emirates. Hebron Emirate, Ramallah Emirate, Shem Emirate.
Controlled by the local families.
This means that the local clans and tribes, that they take control. And they rule their own area.
Territory.
Yeah. Right. Hebron, for example, is 50% of the Palestinian Authority economy. And when we look at Gaza, and people need to understand, Gaza will never connect again with Judea and Samaria. It's a completely different entity. That's it. There is no Palestinian people. There is Hamas and Gaza, and there is Judea and Samaria. And it's two completely different entities. And we can look at Gaza and say, okay, this is already some kind of state, like a different state. So this might happen. And the fifth scenario is that Israel takes control back. I mean, because of anarchy, because of Hamas, or maybe, we need to gain full control of.
So Israeli, do you think the IDF should interfere in case of inner fighting within the Palestinian Authority?
So I think we're not having serious discussions about what's good for us. Whether it's good for us to have one entity, whether it's good to us to have local entities. We're not having this discussion, so we don't know.
Right now you already have two entities, two Palestinian entities,
so
right?
Maybe,
as you said, Hamas, Gaza, and West Bank.
Maybe 3 or 4 is good for us, if it's local leaders who want to actually cooperate with Israel. And Israel needs to have this discussion, because once we figure out what we really want, then we'll know what to do with the army, who to support, who to help.
Do you think that's the reason for Israel's inaction in Gaza, that we don't know what we want?
No, in Gaza it's a whole different story. And the story with Gaza is, first of all, today in Gaza you have no Jewish presence inside Gaza.
Right.
There is an interest in the Israeli governments to keep Gaza and Judea and Samaria separated. So in this sense, having Hamas there...
Oh, we're not, that's not even our making. They do a great job themselves.
They did it themselves, and it serves us.
Sometimes it seems like they hate each other much more than they hate us.
They do, definitely. And the other thing is that when you talk about Gaza, you cannot talk only about Gaza without looking at the broader picture. And the broader picture is that the biggest threat Israel is facing at the moment is Iran. Iran and the northern border. So if you send the army now into Gaza for years of operation, this might undermine the preparations that have been undergoing for a long time to deal with the Iranians and with Hezbollah, which is a much bigger threat to us.
First of all, I have one immediate lesson from in the spotlight is with you, we need 2 hours. I don't know how much our viewers can withstand, but you're touching already on a very important issue of what's happening up north. And let's touch that for a minute. In Lebanon, the state is disintegrating. Hezbollah is there. It's strong, it's powerful, but what's happening with Lebanon and how is that going to affect us and Hezbollah at the same time? And are we ready? You're mentioning Iran. It seems like for the past 20 years, that's what we've been continuously hearing from Israeli governments and leaders. Iran, and yet nothing has really been done to address the core issue of the nuclear power. We just heard Iran announcing it's going to re-enter negotiations with the West. So first of all, up north, what's happening in Lebanon, and is that going to affect Hezbollah and Israel?
Well, as you said, Lebanon is hardly a state anymore. The situation there is terrible. The economy is collapsing. There is a shortage of food. They don't have gas for the cars and so on. And the tensions between the different factions of the Lebanese society are mounting all the time. The Iranians are trying to strengthen their control over Lebanon, trying to bring more money into Lebanon. And the question will be what will be at the end of the day the situation, whether Hezbollah will strengthen and get more control, or the other factions of the society will be fed up, and they are fed up with the Iranians and Hezbollah. I mean, notice, wherever the Iranians have a stronghold, the place collapses. Whether it's Syria, Yemen, Lebanon, everywhere, Iraq, all a mess.
All right.
But the society understands that. They understand that the Iranians bring only trouble.
Right. There has been pushback. When you think about 2006, the Second Lebanon War, it was a terrible war. But at the end of the day, Lebanon was hurt as a result of that war and because of Hezbollah's miscalculations as admitted by Hassan Nasrallah. But even now, Lebanon is a fledgling state. If anything happens with Hezbollah and Israel attacks, there is no more Lebanon. We saw the amazing videos of a few months ago when Hezbollah tried to do something and people from the surrounding villages.
Yeah, the Druze community.
Right.
So listen, the Middle East is organizing itself around three distinct coalitions. One is the Iranian Shia radical coalition that is spreading all over the Middle East. The other one is the Sunni radical coalition. They are divided into two, but let's talk as ISIS. One, okay?
Right.
And the Israeli and moderate Sunni states that are in coalition together against the Iranians and against the radicals.
Right.
The people in Lebanon are asking themselves, in what coalition do we want to be? And it's obvious that most of the society wants to be with Israel and with the moderate Sunni states.
But then you have
they want prosperity, they want economy, they want
live.
A future. Yeah. So they need to push back on Hezbollah. And I think that there is a good chance that we'll see once again Lebanon moving into inner war, a civil war within the society as we saw before.
Do you think there's going to be a civil war or Hezbollah is strong enough to take over Lebanon itself?
I don't think the society will agree so fast for the Hezbollah to completely take over. I think they will fight. There's a good chance there will be a fight on that. And I think this is the prospect I see for Lebanon.
And at the same time, you think Hezbollah will maintain its power with the risk of hundreds of thousands of very focused and targeted missiles aiming at Israel?
So the big question is, what will happen with Iran? If we strengthen the sanctions...
So we go back to the source now.
The source is the whole issue. If we will strengthen the sanction internationally and Iran won't have money, it will have less money to invest in Hezbollah and the militias in Iraq and in Syria and in Yemen. But if there will be going back to the JCPOA and the sanctions will be lifted, we'll see huge amounts of money going to fund terror as we saw in 2015. We will see again fierce fighting all over the Middle East, and we'll see waves of millions of people fleeing the area into Europe.
Amir, President Trump famously withdrew from the JCPOA. And then the criticism was that because the US withdrew from the agreement, the Iranians felt free to move ahead with the nuclear program, which, cost time for Israel and the West because they used these years to move their program forward. And now there will be a potential resumption of the agreement, but the Iranians are already at a different place. So was it wrong in accordance to your opinion, by the Trump administration to withdraw from the JCPOA?
No, I don't think so. I think the JCPOA was a terrible plan. And it was a terrible plan for two reasons. One, it has no inspection. The Iranians from day one didn't adhere to this agreement they signed. The other thing is that the JCPOA had a sunset. I mean, after 15 years, Iran could become fully nuclear. And this doesn't make sense. It's just kicking the can along the road. We need to look at the next generation. Right. Already now 7 years have passed, 7, 8 years have passed And if we continue with the JCPOA, they will anyway have nuclear capability.
But a lot has been happening. Doesn't make sense. A lot has been happening with Iran. We've seen war on the high seas with ships, targeted on both sides, including Israeli business people who has been targeted. Sure. You're seeing a situation where cyber attacks are happening continuously. We hear, from Iran on the train stations, gas stations, etc. We're seeing terrible realities in Israel where what is seemed to be Iranian hackers are, immobilizing an Israeli hospital, are targeting insurance companies.
But Shahar, notice that everything that is happening, and also the acceleration of the nuclear plan, has happened in the last few months.
Right.
And the reason is that the Iranians feel that there is a weak European Union, they are weak on them, and they feel that this administration is not strong enough against them, and wants desperately to get some kind of agreement. And they feel empowered, and they feel they can do anything. And this is why they're behaving the way they're behaving.
But internally, the situation for them, for the regime, is not easy within Iran. We're seeing fractures every once in a while, even though they try to keep it away from the public. Every once in a while, you have glimpses of these fractures.
Yeah. The economical situation in Iran is terrible. COVID is terrible in Iran. Now, the Iranian society, 50% of the society are not Persian. 50% of them, 25% are Azaris, and you have Arabs, and you have Kurds. And even within the 50% who are Persian, many of them don't support this regime. They are conservative in their way of thinking, but they don't support this radical regime. So Iran is facing a lot of inner problems. And I think that if the Western society will be more favorable towards these factions that are opposing this terrible regime, we might see a change at the end of the day. I mean, in the long term, I'm optimistic. And I can tell you that the Iranian society overall, they like the Jewish people and they like Israel. It's only a fraction, this terrible regime that is against and is threatening us existentially, moving towards a nuclear bomb. And we are preparing very seriously to counter that and attack them. Just a matter of time.
You're talking about the regime change, but would you say that in light of American experience in the Middle East and what happened in Iraq and elsewhere, the desires of the US administration to replace the regime, to build a democracy, it didn't really work when it came to Iraq, when it came to just recently Afghanistan. So you think that in Iran, the idea of regime change is a viable goal for the international community?
I think it is, but not in a way of conquering Iran and, occupying them or whatever. It's just giving the society, the Iranian society, an understanding that the Western world supports this idea. Let them do the work, And with the harsher sanctions on this regime, at the end of the day, at a certain point, I believe that the society will say, okay, we had enough of this regime, so we might see a change. Now, talking about the nuclear issue, you don't need to conquer Iran, you don't need anything. One major airstrike, and that's it. It's not that complicated. I don't know why there's so much talking.
No, maybe because of the ramifications, the response. You just mentioned the Iranian networks all over the Middle East, the risks of terror, of missiles raining over Israel and other moderate Arab states.
I can tell you, in every operation we ever had, before the operation, you always had people saying what a disaster it will be afterwards and so on. I believe that if the Western world unites and attacks these nuclear installations and destroys them, as we did in Iraq at the time, as we did in Syria, this will pretty much solve the issue. And I don't see such dramatic ramifications, especially if we are united in a coalition. The problem is that Israel might find itself needing to do it by itself. And this is bad news.
Amir, I have to be honest with you. We only have a few minutes left, and I could go on for hours because this is the most fascinating and important topic to discuss. But because I want to maintain continuity for you, for me, and for our viewers, can you please tell us, how can our viewers keep in touch with information coming from you? In a sea of information, sometimes it's difficult to know where to go to understand the issues, and especially complex issues like what's happening in the Middle East. So where should they visit? Where should they go to learn to keep up to date when it comes to Israel and the Middle East?
So first of all, we have our website, idsf.org.il.
idsf.org.il.
Yeah. And we are very active on social media. We have Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. We write articles both in Israel and for the international community. And we brief a lot. So in our website, you can invite a briefing, ask for a briefing, whether it's for a Jewish community, whether it's for policymakers, whether it's somebody wants to host people. Today also we do it a lot on Zoom. Since the COVID, Zoom became very popular.
Right.
But we're also more than happy to fly over and meet. And we have many connections with the think tanks and the Jewish organizations. And I think that what is special about what we are doing at the end of the day, as we said before, we are an authoritative voice of generals with a lot of experience who can talk about all these issues and bring our know-how. And we have experts in every single field you can imagine, talking about national security.
With thousands of experts and generals.
And they, maybe even more importantly so, everything we do generates from our Jewish Zionistic values.
Right.
This is the basic for everything we do.
Right. As was clearly stated in your mission. I can't thank you enough for this great opportunity to sit together, not on Zoom, in person, and discuss the issues right here at JBS in Times Square. Thank you for the time and for your service for Israel and for the Jewish people.
Thank you very much, Shahar. It was great being here. Thanks.
I'd like to thank you again, Amir, for joining us and for all that you do for the security and defense and prosperity of the State of Israel and the Jewish people. This is truly highly appreciated, and we wish you and all of us much success in safeguarding the one and only Jewish state in the world. I believe that today's session was able to explain some of the complex issues that so many of us face when we read the op-eds and the news, and I'm thankful for the time we've had to dedicate to that issue and put it in the spotlight. I'm Shahar Azani. I'd like to thank all of you for watching, listening, and understanding, and I'm looking forward to seeing you next time in the spotlight.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.